What's going on, guys? Cody from MotorcycleMD. In this video, we are going to do a complete and full step-by-step guide to replacing the fork seals on a GL1800 Goldwing. In this video specifically, we will be using a 2012 ABS model, but from the first time in 2001 up until 17, 18, whenever they stopped with the two front forks on the Goldwing, this video applies to you. And I didn't want to skip anything, and I want to make sure that if you were going to do this, you would see the exact procedures, the torque specs, the tools used, and everything that you need to know about doing this job correctly, safely, so that you can be confident when you go back out on the road after you completed such a job like this. So if the fork seals are leaking on your bike and this is a guide that you've been looking for, here you go. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We do videos on motorcycle repair, maintenance, project builds, motor overhauls. As a professional motorcycle technician for Honda, I've seen some things and I want to share those with you. Actually, in the description there's a course, 40 plus videos on just how to take care of your bike practically. Things that you can actually do with your own two hands without the need of a shop per se. If that's something that you're interested in, be sure to pick that up before you go. Otherwise, let's get this Goldwing on the bench and get to work. Also, one quick thing that I'll add as you witness me put this Goldwing up on the bench by myself, not recommended. All right, I've been doing this for over a decade. I'm confident in my ability to control the motorcycle by putting it on a center stand or even taking it back off. You can totally do this job on the ground. I'm doing it on the bench because I can get it up in the air. That's what I'm used to doing, and I can get way better footage for you guys as to what we're looking at as we do this full job together. So please just be mindful and safe about what you're doing with this job. So the first thing I like to do before I lift these things up is just go ahead and go after the top pinch bolts for the forks. They're right underneath this black cover here, 12mm head. A wrench sometimes works, a nice shallow socket will work as well. But whatever you can do to finesse a wrench or a socket down in there to loosen up both right and left only. Just those two pinch bolts before we lift this thing up. This side's the hardest one because the throttle cables are in the way. But if you can push down on the throttle cables with that, you can usually get onto it. One thing I want you to pay attention to is just the routing of these throttle cables. If you reach in here and feel, you can get a sense that the throttle cables and how they're routed, they're on the inboard side of the fork, not on the outboard side. So when you go to slip this thing out and back in again, we want the throttle cables to be routed correctly, obviously, and they go on the inboard side of the fork. So just pay attention to how that's routed. So that one's loose, we can loosen the left side up. I think this will fit all the way up. I haven't lifted a Goldwing up on this thing yet. Let's find out. It fits. So this one is the fork in question. It's starting to seep around it. But it has not leaked down onto the calipers yet, which is awesome. It's just starting. Common thing. The left one's not leaking yet, but I imagine that we're going to go ahead and just do both of them, because when one goes, the other one's usually right behind it. So we're going to start with removing all this plastic. We got the front fender, we got the two caliper side covers, the rear fender, as well as this top brace section. These two bolts are different size lengths. Keep that in mind. Two bolts back here. These are both the same size. Sorry, the color balance changed. We're not outside. Let's go ahead and grab these two top ones. Right back here is a little pop snap, kind of right behind this shield. You can get underneath one of the edges with a flat blade screwdriver and pop that up. Like that, kind of pops down into its own hole, and you just get on that ledge and lift it up. We got a little 8mm head bolt right here, same on the other side. We got another one right down here. And we got a 10mm head right here, which goes into the fender as well. That should be now free. 8mm head bolt right here. And that should be able to drop this rear fender down. So the way that I get these off is I just push this down. So kind of push it down towards the tire, then you can just slide this guy right out. All right, we'll focus on these two right here. The 6mm Allen. I never know how tight these things are, so. I'll leave that one in still. Let's grab this Torx bolt right down here. I think it's a T40. And then we'll grab this pivot bolt right down here. This just gives us a lot more freedom to move this caliper all around. The last one right here is the small one. It's holding on to an adapter piece in the back. I want to make sure that's nice and loose. Now this can freely get out of our way. Okay. We have one more piece, which is our anti-dive, the infamous anti-dive. And this anti-dive is pretty infamous for having problems. But really it's just with the earlier Goldwings up to like 2006. They had a pretty crappy design, and when it would fail, and it would fail usually because of lack of maintenance and I think kind of a product design as well. But this is actually, there's brake fluid that you can bleed from here, and a lot of people skip this step when they're bleeding the brakes on a service. And not bleeding this, if you've ever seen really bad brake fluid, it gets really mucky, man. It gets nasty and dries hard, and it can make this stuff kind of fail. And they would fail, and they would lock. It's an anti-dive, so when you apply brake pressure, it's supposed to help with the diving action of the forks, but they would lock to a point where it would blow the fluid right out of the fork on this left-hand side. But after 2006, they changed the design a little bit, and we haven't had nearly as many problems with them. If you are nervous about it, let's get both bolts out. There's a couple of tricks people do. They'll space them out with a little nickel, and they'll kind of drill a hole through the nickel. I'll show you why here in a second. But it has this little tit on the end, right? So people will put a nickel, and they'll drill a hole out that size, and they'll put it right down here, and then re-bolt with some longer bolts or whatever to not activate this bottom section. What we were doing for a long time is we would just cut this piece right off. Really, there was no noticeable difference on the dive function of the bike or whatever. We would just kind of take it out of the system by just cutting that off. But these newer models, there really is no problem with them, so I'm just going to leave this one intact. This bottom portion seems to be functioning just fine. It's not locked solid. But these, you can't open them up and service them, you know. You can take this all apart, but they're not meant to come apart. Usually you just replace them, but we're not going to mess with it. Grab these two caliper bolts here. This model with the ABS version, there's a little hanger right here, and this is supposed to be bent back over, but it's just been bent out of the way, and that's what I do anyways to get this line out and to access this bolt. So on your model, if you're doing this applies to any of the Goldwings that still use forks, you just may not see this little bracket piece here. No big deal. And this caliper can now float its way off. Just be careful with this ABS sensor, try not to bang it on anything. And now this whole rear brake system should be loose and can hang by itself. Now let's just go after, doesn't really matter what order, but we can loosen these pinch bolts. We'll grab this guy here. It's a little unnecessary, but I don't have my breaker bar with me. Okay, we can just back this bolt out. We'll leave it in though. We can use it again. Grab these pinch bolts. Oh yeah, man, these things are tight. Nice and loose. Axle's loose, pinch bolts are loose. Now we gotta lift this thing up a little bit. Grab us a jack. I like to just use the center beam, or the center mating surface of the case, kind of right behind the oil drain bolt. This jack has a nice, it's like a car jack, you know, but it has a nice little ridge in the center. Kind of protects it, but regardless, I always like to put some type of rag, or a piece of wood, or whatever you want to do. And all we're trying to do, if you saw when I strapped this thing down, was just leave a little bit of slack in my lines, because we're gonna obviously tilt this thing upwards, but we need just enough to get this tire to spin. That's all we need, just barely off the ground. We can tighten these straps back up, but we're not trying to lift this thing way up and touch the rear tire on the ground. We're just trying to get it just so it spins, and we're already there. One thing I did forget to look at while we had the bike down was just how high up the fork top is coming out of the top tree. They're supposed to be, I'll show you once the fork is out, typically at this one spot. Sometimes just from people working on it, they'll get a little bit higher, a little bit lower. It doesn't really matter too much. Obviously you don't want a whole crap ton of forks sticking out of the top, but they're where they should be and they're level. So again, I'll show you once the fork is down. Now we're getting to the good stuff. Fork's getting ready to come out, front tire's loose. One thing that we can check while we're here is the steering head bearings. Going left to right, we should feel a nice smooth action left to right. There's tools that in the manual they'll say like have a little weighted thing and pull on it and how much poundage it takes to turn it. I really don't pay attention to that too often. If the forks are insanely loose, you'll feel some rocking kind of back and forth in the top tree, but I don't, and this feels very, very smooth. Sometimes if the steering head bearings are worn out, shot. Front tire changes, you should just be checking this. No notching. The tire does not want to sit into some type of weird pocket, either left or right. This feels very smooth throughout its whole movement, left and right. But if you do feel notching in there, it's time for some steering head bearings, and that's a completely different ballgame. With that axle nut still in the axle, we can just kind of tap this thing out. I like to use a little round Phillips head or something that'll fit inside this hole right here. And we can just kind of spin this and work this out. This is when you want these straps in play, because now you've taken weight off of that front of the bike. And hopefully your axle comes out nice and smooth. We have our right side spacer, we have our left side spacer. And we'll leave them on the bench just like that so you know how they go back together. Okay, let's go ahead and grab this right fork down. 12mm socket, we got our 2 bolts right here. We already loosened that top one. And sometimes on Goldwings, people like to throw every single piece of light and plastic they can on these, and you got different auxiliary switches and GPSs and disco balls and blenders and everything, and they'll run different harnesses around stuff. So now would be the time to look and see how these things are routed. Again, your throttle cables are on the inboard side of your fork. Everything else should be as well, unless someone else just wired some crazy stuff up there. I think this guy does have a little Garmin wire, which is routed correctly. So trying to use as minimal force of pulling the bike as possible. You can kind of brace your hands here, trying to keep safety in mind to not die. And this fork should just slide right down. If you have a bench vise, that'd be great to do this with. If you don't and you have a nice strong impact driver, then you can do this as well. But we got to get this bottom bolt out. So I like to put this into a vise. And what I use on every fork ever is a manual impact driver. For this one, we'll need a longer 6mm Allen, just because this is recessed down into this bottom section so far that a normal one that you would buy from the store might just be too short. So a longer one is helpful. Impact drivers are awesome. And we'll spin this to the left so it's ready to be loosened up. Nice big heavy hammer. And don't be afraid of how hard you hit it. This part seems to make people a little bit nervous of just how hard to hit this, but you want to whack the crap out of it because you want to break this bolts loose, right? So we'll just try to do one nice quick hit. There's 2, and that broke it loose. It's loose now. And once I break it loose, I'm just going to tighten it just by hand like that. Now this bike does not have enough miles on it for me to be concerned about pulling the guts out of this actual shock here. But we're going to get this thing apart. We're going to pull this bottom section off, and this is how we do it. And it's a messy procedure. So, here's our fork seal right here. We're just going to take a little flathead screwdriver. Try not to mar up this bottom section. We're just going to get right underneath that seal. And pop that up. Inside of here is a snap ring. Just find one side of it. There's our little snap ring right there. Now, take this bottom bolt out. There should be a crush washer underneath the bolt. Fork fluid smells like fish. As usual, our washer is still stuck in there, but that's not a big deal right now. So now we tip this thing over, and we are going to get the fluid out by just slowly pumping up and down. And this stuff is very dark. like to do this until this part starts to bottom out. I'm just separating them two, and we're going to literally use this fork as a slide hammer and separate them apart like that. Does not take that much force, or it shouldn't. And there we go. And we are going to sit and let this part drain out for a good 30 minutes. And inside of here is a little aluminum seat that sits on the bottom of here that will eventually fall out. There we go. So, we'll let this thing drain. So it's been about an hour, okay? In a perfect world, I would already be done. But I'd also have a parts washer, and a parts washer is super helpful when doing forks. And you can get these things cleaned up real quick, inside and out, but I don't have one. So any sponsors out there who want to give me a parts washer, I'll be happy to take one. We're gonna have to clean these things by hand. And I'm just gonna use fuel, gasoline, and this bowl, which may or may not react to gasoline, no idea yet, but gas is going to work really well. And if I were you, just have a bunch of rags. So we're going to wipe these things down by hand, the best that we possibly can, and set them off to the side. And we'll do that with everything that we're touching. This is just going to be really annoying to do, but it works well, you know, it works well. I really like to get these exteriors or these lower fork bottoms as clean as possible. That way it looks like you did a good job, you know, and for the customer or whoever, and you can be proud that your forks are nice and clean, right? It comes off pretty easily with gas. But I want to get down inside of this bottom fork. And just simply wiping this around the bottom, you'll see that it'll actually take up. There's some muck down at the bottom, but not a lot. Sometimes they're way worse. When you got a lot of miles on these things, that stuff can really turn pretty gross and smell just awful. Just awful. I shouldn't need to warn you guys about flammable objects, so I just want to keep doing this until that gas comes out nice and clean. Go buy you a stack of those shop towels that you can get at the auto parts store. I use these Wipe All brand. They come in 2 different packs of 252 sheets. They're lint free. They're awesome. I love them. I always have a box ready. As you can see, nice and clean. Set that off to the side. We'll clean and detail that up a little bit more here in a bit. But we have this guy still. Should pretty much be drained out. That was a good hour's time. And we have to inspect some parts. So we have our main fork seal right here. Now the left fork might be a little bit different with the seals. I'm only going to show you guys one fork rebuild because it's the exact same process, but the other one might have an extra seal. And I'll show you guys that if I run into it. I can't remember which year has it. We have our backup ring right here, which actually has a double spacer in it. Sometimes you'll run into a Goldwing that only has one. This one, the right side, has 2. Okay, now we'll take up our slider bushing right here. This one just comes right off. And what we're looking for, stay. On the inside, this is our slider for the lower bottom fork section. On the inside of this slider is like a Teflon material. And we're looking to make sure that that hasn't been worn away. What you'll see, which I'll show you on this other one, which is way more common. It's not as common to find these ones worn out. Usually they're almost never worn out, to be honest. But with a lot of miles, sometimes they can be. But we're looking for that Teflon grayish material to be worn away, and you'll see like almost like a brass finish underneath. That means it's been worn out, and you would want to replace that. This one looks awesome. And then we have this one here. This is the one that stays on here. We can pry this off. But you can see this one is worn slap out. This is the most common one that you'll find worn out on these. Is the one that sticks on this fork slider. These ones go bad all the time. And you can see that coloration starting to show through now. We got Teflon back here on the back side, but not on the front side. So we'll just take this off, get a little flathead screwdriver, very carefully just pry them apart, and you can slide this thing off. And we'll just clean up that mating surface. If we wanted to, what we could do is we could just take some gasoline and just kind of flush this bottom section out. or if you wanted to, you can tip this upside down and pour it straight down into here. And what we're doing is we're kind of accessing the springs, or the spring that's in there, as well as this piston section, and we can just drain it right back out again. And that's just kind of flushing any of that older fluid out of the top. It's up to you. This is kind of going above and beyond, but it's just nice to get any older. If the fluid's really, really nasty, I'll usually spend a little more time flushing this kind of stuff out. What can happen, which is kind of annoying, is this silver piston right here. Once this gets so clean right in this section, it'll actually want to fall back down, and we don't really want that because we're trying to screw back into that bottom piece there. So just be careful with that. If it does happen to ride up, grab a longer bolt and pull it back to the bottom and try to leave it up this way in this orientation so it just doesn't escape down into there, because it just makes it kind of annoying when you're going to put that bolt back in there. And you can actually push it up and not even be able to thread into it, if that makes sense. Now, one thing I do want to check after we've let that thing kind of dry out is we're going to check the mating surface of this. And you can see this is the rust mark, the rust line where it was sitting in the triple tree. And we want to kind of get rid of that, as well as any other pits or little rust. Sometimes you run into these things, man, and they're just pitted all the way down. And if that is the case with you, I would just look at replacing it. We want this to be beautifully smooth and polished up. And his is great. His bike is very, very clean. So we're just going to get rid of this rust line right here. And I'll show you how. Just have some 4/0 steel wool. Very, very fine stuff. And you can just work on that section very lightly. Then what I like to do is take a little bit of just some polishing compound. I don't care what brand, Turtle Wax, whatever. I'll just take that and rub that into the section. Kind of helps seal this thing up a little bit, give it some life. Kind of helps keep it from rusting, at least for a short amount of time. But if you do have a fork that is completely shot and you don't want to replace it because of whatever reason, taping it up obviously is an option. Your sliding surface is super important, because if you have pitting down in your sliding surface where this thing is kind of riding at, it's going to tear the new seal up immediately. And if you try to slide a brand new seal down onto a pitted fork, it's going to tear that seal on its way down. So taping it up with electrical tape is an option. You really want to get rid of any of those burrs that you can feel with your hand. But again, if yours is junk, I would just recommend replacing it. Alright, so we got some fresh parts to put in. We got our fork seal set. This one is, I think, for the left-hand side. It has this extra third little rubber backer seal in it. It's not this side. The right side, just a regular dust seal and an oil seal. We have our new slider bushing. That's the one that was bad. And we have our new sealing washer for the bottom bolt. Alright, our new bushing will just slide on there. Give it a little spin. Looks great. We have our bushing that is fine. It's good to go. Slide that up top there. We have our two little metal spacers here. I put them flat side towards each other. We have our bottom metal piston right here. It's going to sit on there just like that. Try to keep this upright if you can. Bottom fork leg. And just send that right up to the bottom. Kind of hear it kind of pop into a little seat. Leave that down like that. Got our new oil seal. As you can see, there is a spring section up top that will face us. We have a cupped section, kind of like a big trench in that holds the oil down. So we have our spring up top. We also have a spring down below, but the cupped section is going to go downwards. So we're going to be looking up at these little hash marks all around it. Alright, we'll grab our seal, put a little bit of grease on the inside lip of this. Oh, that's too much. I don't care what kind of grease it is, something light. Anything is better than nothing. Slide this down in the correct orientation to its home. Grab our 45mm inside diameter slide hammer. This is what they look like. They can split apart, some of them. I don't care which one you use. It's a 45. It has to be able to sit and bang that seal in, as well as not hit the outer casing. So we'll just pop this in. You kind of hear a difference in the tone once it's seated. There it is. And I can see the inner land where this guy will live. If you want to put a little grease on this, you can. Send this guy down. And verify that it's sitting inside of there, and it is. Alright, that's sealed right there, okay? Kind of clean that grease back off. Then we're going to flip this thing over on its head, and now we get to the filling. Alright, so we'll be using SS8, Honda's 10 weight fork oil. They call for a 10 weight. I don't care which one you use. This is what we'll be using. And this calls for about 16.5. It's 16.4 plus or minus. So whenever they give you a plus or minus, they're saying you can swing on the low end or the high end of that. It's 0.08 of a difference. We're looking at 16.4 for this right side fork. Got me a ratio right. There's another way you can do this with a level, like a suction syringe, and measure the level, but I think it's a little bit unnecessary because I can achieve and get into the ballpark of how much fork fluid goes in here with just a ratio right. And there's actually a marker right on here, which is 16. So we know that for a fact, this bottle, per the markings on the side, can hold 16 ounces, right? And we're talking half of an ounce, 0.4. Just raise it up slightly. These forks are not that sensitive to be like, oh man, you're 0.05 of an ounce off. I'm gonna function differently. It's not that serious. We're pretty darn close. 16, we're about 16 and a half right here. And we have that swing of 0.08. So I save these nice little tops off of Final Drive oil stuff because it's really easy to get the fluid inside the fork like this. And what I'll do is I'll take this, I'm going to raise this fork up slightly so it's not bottomed out. I'm going to get a towel around this in case I have any spillage. Give this a little squeeze and then let it loose and drop it on down in there. And we're just going to aim it directly at that hole and fill this bad boy up. At times that I would use like a leveling gauge inside of these is if I were to like royally screw up and spill this oil all over the place, right? And it leaks all out or it overflows and it dumps out, and then I have no idea where I'm at. I have no idea where the fluid is at, how much made it in, how much spilled out. Then I would look into using a leveling gauge to pull the top cap of this fork off, pull the spring out, pull the spacer out, and then measure the level of the fluid in there, because then I would have no idea where I was at. But right now we're looking good. No spillage. Alright, I still need to get that washer out of the top of this thing. See if we can't come in through the side of this. And get that washer out. Grab our old bolt, it has some sludge on it. Get this all off. Sometimes you'll find some silicone on the bottom. If you want to use some type of silicone, you can. I don't find it necessary. I think as long as you replace these crush washers, they seal up perfectly. We'll just drop this down inside of there. We're just going to lightly screw this thing in so we don't push that little silver part down. Tighten that up by hand. We got a little bit of oil come out the top. We can come back over to here. This is going to get about 20 Newton meters. It's not a lot. I'm going to go ahead and torque this down. Kind of pump this thing up a little bit. You kind of feel it pump up and then it'll retract a lot slower. Take our dust seal, slide this down. Push in one side, push in the other. That is a fully rebuilt fork, ready to go. And what I was mentioning earlier as far as how far up into that clamp you want this thing to sit when you're looking up top, I like to set it right below this crease line right here. So just set that clamp right underneath it, so there's a little bit hanging out. On both of them, it's a great place to mark it, and you know the other one will be the same way, but just right up to the bottom of this crease mark, that's where your clamp will then go. We just want to make sure that we slide this thing up and get our cables and stuff out of the way, and don't slam this into your finger because it sucks. But just keep those throttle cables on the inside of the fork, any other harnessing, that kind of stuff. I'm just going to kind of get a feel for where it's at right here, and we'll use our socket wrench and just kind of snug one of these bolts up so this can't fall down. And then we'll look up top to see where we're at. We're a little bit too high up. And you'll just walk this back and forth until you get it into that spot. And these pinch bolts right here will get 29 Newton meters. The top one gets 26. That one's a little bit harder to measure because it's just hard to get to. But once you feel the pressure of this one, usually you can get pretty darn close with up top. There's one. There's two, and I'll go back to that other one, double check. There we go. All right, so we're on the left side fork now. This one's a little bit different. And I just wanted to take a second to show you guys that. Not too much difference, but we have obviously this anti-dive valve. We're not gonna worry about servicing this or taking this off. What I like to do is just to flush out, because there is a hole for it down inside of here. Gasoline or parts cleaner or something like that. All I want to do is just run this down, and it will actually go down inside of that port. And we're just going to help to flush that portion out. Otherwise, you're buying gaskets and stuff for this, and it's just really unnecessary. Never had a problem with these before, so I just kind of flush out that big hole. It's kind of right down the bottom, and it feeds down into the bottom. And I'll just take this and flip it and let this drain out. And that's just going to keep flushing that portion out. If there's any muck in there, but this one was actually very, very clean on the inside, so I'm not too concerned about it. But again, we're just going to keep letting that dry out. Another part that you haven't seen, because it's not on this right side fork, is this bushing right here. We just want to make sure that this is nice and clean. Okay, there's needle bearings inside of here, so making sure that this little pivot is nice and clean. And you re-grease these needle bearings right here. You're going to push this back through there, and it should rotate nice and smooth. Okay, you can replace these and get new bushings for them if they were dried out, you know, or if this is locked up, but you have to manually press that out with a press. But we want it to just pivot nice and clean with some fresh grease in there as well. But our fork seal lineup is a little bit different with this one. We have some dirt all on top of this one, but this fork still looks really good. Some small parts that I want to kind of address here when I go to clean this thing up, but our seals are a little bit different, and I just wanted to pay attention to that. So we have our main oil seal. We're used to seeing that. Trash. Another spacer, just like we saw on the other one that had two of them. We want to make sure that's nice and cleaned up. And then we have this kind of oddball one. Right underneath that is another rubber wiper seal with an aluminum spacer on it. Take this off to show you. It's just how I pulled it up, just like this, the seal facing upwards. So there's that rubber seal, and that actually sits into an aluminum land underneath it. See how it's kind of cupped on the inside, and that has a ridge on it. They sit together, and they go down just like that. But we will be replacing this wiper seal right here. Okay, down here at our bottom section, you'll notice that it's different. There's no aluminum cap that goes on the bottom of this. There's just a spring doohickey right here. We still have that same bushing that, guess what, if we rotate this around, is completely worn out. Okay, we're down the metal right here. Very common to see. There's nothing wrong with the bike. There's nothing wrong with your bike. This part just wears out, which is why we want to pay attention to this stuff. And this one takes 17.9 fluid ounces, plus or minus 0.08. So we're pretty much right under 18. I mean, just a hair under 18 fluid ounces. New crush washer, lock this in with 20 millimeters of torque. We'll install this, and there's a couple of things I want to show you guys when it comes to just making sure everything is kosher, everything is lined up. So, putting this left one back together, I ran into a little bit of a problem where I cannot get my screw to screw back in there. No matter how many times I move this up, we can't get that thing to screw in. It's just sitting on top of that top stem. So, sometimes you can just get this and spin it, and it'll lock right back in down like that. Okay, if that didn't work, which it should work, you can take something long and skinny, and you're just trying to center that part. You can kind of grab a hold of it and just center it down into this hole, and that should all line back up again. Just want to show you a quick thing, because someone will watch this and that will happen. They'll think they screwed it all up and they'll take it all back apart again, and what a mess that would be. So once we locate that bottom section, this should just screw right in. You'll notice that this one has a little bit different reaction. Looks like it uses way more spring than it does fluid, whereas the other one's a lot different, but we're good to go. Alright, so once we have our forks torqued down, one quick check we can make is grab our axle. This should be able to slip into here and into that other fork pretty easily. Okay, just by moving it back and forth, it should slip right in. That way we're not fighting, these forks are not already pre-bound or whatever. So we want to make sure that's nice and level, which we have. This is great. Alright, so we're going to prep a little bit. Some things we want to make sure is clean before we start putting them back together. This is the stuff that I do every single time. Grab some contact cleaner. We're going to clean this axle up. Get all the old grease off the bottom. We also have our wheel spacers, these nasty things right here. I get these nice and cleaned up again. Otherwise I just cake on all kinds of crap and it'll eventually just wear out the dust seals that they go into. Nice and clean. Same with this other side. We're going to move our brake caliper over just a little bit. We're going to go ahead and just mount this anti-dive right here. This kind of helps pull the calipers up out of the way. We can move this bracket over slightly because we have that bolt right there that I want to put in. This one's easy to cross thread, okay? So just pay attention, do it by hand, find your hole. That's generally where we want this. We can put this right back into our little pivot here, so it's kind of holding it. This other side is just going to bounce off the tire when we go to push that in. It's no big deal. Okay, axle is clean. We're going to re-grease this now. I just use Amsoil synthetic water-based grease. I always try to put links in the description of what I'm using for you guys. But any grease is good grease. All-purpose grease, bearing grease, whatever you want to use. We just want to make sure that we just lube this thing up. Get your flathead screwdriver ready to go through this hole right here, because this is just really the easiest way to install this thing. Get your little T-handle. Make sure we got the right orientation of the tire going forward. We can check our wheel bearings right here while we're here. Nice free spinning wheel bearings. No notching, no nothing like that, which is great. What I like to also do, grab another clean rag, contact cleaner, and I'll just wipe the face of this dust seal and just the inside lip and get that kind of black crud out, which is just old grease. Just clean this up nice. Okay, there's no tears or anything that's coming apart on it. Just clean that up. Grab some brand new grease. We're just going to coat the inside of that lip again. No need to go crazy, just put some in there. And I'll re-wipe that. We don't want anything greasy hanging out to collect road grime. In a perfect world, this spacer is just going to sit and seal that off for us. Okay, perfect. Same thing on the other side. Alright, now we'll just weasel our way through here. Try to keep our spacers intact. Our forks should be pretty close to where they were. Might need to lift up a little bit on the tire. Once it's lined up, it should just kind of work itself in. Sweet. Until it stops. Grab our bolt. We'll throw a little bit of medium weight Loctite on this. Nothing crazy. For Honda's Loctite, it is the orange. We're going to tighten this axle nut up first. Put our little rod to the other side so we can hold that axle. This should get 59 Newton meters. There we go. Go ahead and install this side caliper. This brake pad should not have changed because you should not have hit the brakes at all, unless you're doing a brake job. We got our 2 bolts. Again, medium weight Loctite, 31 Newton meters of torque. We got a bunch of different bolts over on this side. So first we want to do, make sure that's in our pivot right there. We're going to try to sneak this caliper on. There's that. Throw in our lower pinch bolt, lightweight thread locker. We'll throw in our special Torx bolt. We'll throw in our 2 bracket bolts for our secondary master. This one can be a little bit more difficult because you got to kind of line this guy up. Okay, now once these bolts are in, we can start torquing stuff down. This bottom one gets 31. This joint bolt, the Torx one, gets 26. That should be able to pivot. Which it does, because of that pivot right there. And these ones will get 31's fine. I think it's 30 is the spec, but. So we can go ahead and lower this bike down a little bit. Put some pressure back on that front wheel. Now we have a super vital part that we need to double check. Because this lower fork bottom has the ability to move in and out on this axle. It's not fixed over here, just over here. The axle's tight. It's locked in over here, but not over here. So we actually have some wiggle room to set this thing right. On the end of this axle, there is a line that you would have saw. In a perfect world, in the manual, they want you to move this over to that line to line up with it, then you would lock this thing down. But what I'm really looking for is if we apply the brakes, they're all pumped back up again, is if we look straight down through here and how the rotor is sitting between both sides. And we want that to be very even, okay? Because there's adjustability there. If that caliper, the right side of that caliper is resting on the rotor, then it's going to grind and you'll hear it as soon as you start to take off. We want to center this rotor in between that caliper, and you do that by just moving this fork bottom either over to the right or to the left. Most oftentimes you're moving it over to the right to line up with that line right there. But this is a super vital step that people who do not know will not do this, and then they can screw stuff up. So I'm just going to use a flat blade screwdriver, a big fat one, resting in between the spacer of the wheel and the fork bottom. I'm going to see where the rotor is at in relativeness to the caliper. Slide it over slightly, and we'll tighten these down. This gets 22 Newton meters, but we're just going to lock it down for right now. And on this right side, we'll actually leave these loose for right now. We're going to put everything back together. The fenders, the plastics, put them all back on. If you have ring of fire stuff, that's on you, okay? You got to leave that stuff loose until we do this final step. But we're going to put all this stuff back together, right where it belongs, get this thing back off the bench. Then we're going to seat this axle. Then we'll torque this down one final time. And we'll also make sure that we remember to tighten up those top pinch bolts. Last and final step, everything's been torqued down the sides of those right two pinch bolts. We're just going to seat these bad boys, just dive them in. Front suspension's working. Torque them down. Of course, that's not the final step. The final step, obviously, is making sure that the test ride goes well.